My ex-husband stole my inheritance, married my aunt, and now he expects me to be their future child's godparent. I never expected to see my ex-husband again, certainly not at the front door of my grandfather's old Victorian house, the place where I'd grown up, the place I loved more than anywhere else on earth. Yet there he stood, broad-shouldered and polished, wearing that self-assured grin he'd perfected years ago. It was late evening, the sun halfway down the sky, and I had just finished planting geraniums by the wraparound porch. My heart jolted at the sight of him, not in longing, but in a surge of bitterness. It wasn't so long ago that he'd managed to worm his way into my heart, my life, and ultimately into my finances in the most devious manner possible. He had no right to be here where I felt safest. He glanced around, hands tucked in his trouser pockets as though he owned the place. "Hey, Tessa," he said, voice artificially casual. "Got a minute?" I stared at him, my cheeks flushing despite the cool breeze. "No, what do you want, Brian?" My words came out sharper than I intended, but I wasn't in the mood to play nice. "Come on," he said with that drawl that had once melted me. "You gonna make me stand out here all night?" I wiped my dirt-stained hands on my gardening apron. "You're not welcome, so whatever this is, make it quick." He pressed his lips together in a tight smile as though pained. "I'd rather do this inside," he murmured. That was an absurd request. This was my family's house mine after my grandfather passed away and left it to me. Brian had no business crossing that threshold ever again. Still, something compelled me to keep the peace, if only to avoid a scene in front of any neighbors who might pass by. With a weary sigh, I jerked my head. "Fine, come in, but this had better be important." I stepped aside, letting him into the foyer. The interior was all warm wood paneling, antique rugs, and the faint smell of lemon polish. My grandmother had decorated the place decades ago, and though some considered it outdated, I found it comforting. I'd spent countless childhood evenings roaming these halls, listening to my grandparents tell stories about family traditions and future hopes. Brian and I had once roamed these halls together, too. Before we got married, we'd come to visit my grandfather, who adored my then-fiancé. Little did Grandpa know that the charming man I'd introduced him to would eventually prove to be a master manipulator. I folded my arms, nodding for Brian to speak. He cleared his throat. "I know it's been intense, everything between us," he began, "but I wanted to see you face to face. I have news." "News?" I repeated flatly, refusing to offer him a seat. He glanced around, clearly remembering the layout where the living room was, where the stairs led up to the second floor. Finally, his gaze settled on me again. "I'm going to be a father." A cold spike pierced my chest. At first, I just stared, not fully processing. Then I asked, "A father? Are you seeing someone?" As soon as the words left my mouth, I realized how naive they sounded. Of course he was seeing someone. There was no shortage of women who fell for Brian's polished charm. He gave me a strange, tight smile. "Actually, it's Miranda." It took a few seconds for that name to click in my head, and once it did, I felt my stomach plunge. "Miranda," I repeated, my voice trembling with shock and anger. "You're telling me you're having a baby with my Aunt Miranda?" My aunt was older than me by only a few years. My grandfather had started a second family late in life, so she and I had grown up more like cousins. The idea that Brian had ended up with her was surreal. He nodded, wincing at my accusatory tone. "Look, I know how it sounds, but after you and I divorced..." He trailed off. I could guess the rest. My Aunt Miranda had always been impulsive, rebellious, the one in the family who chased excitement and drama. It figured she'd be drawn to a man like Brian, who thrived on both. Still, the betrayal stung like a fresh slap. Miranda had been aware of everything he'd done to me, how he'd manipulated me and stolen the inheritance my grandfather left me when he passed. Yet here she was, apparently pregnant by the same man. I exhaled, steadying my voice so it wouldn't crack. "And what does this have to do with me?" Brian had the gall to look sheepish. "We're getting married next month, and Miranda wants you at the wedding. More than that, she wants you to be the baby's godmother. I told her that might be complicated, but she insisted it would mean a lot. So I came to extend the invitation, to see if you'd be willing to talk to her." My jaw dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." He stepped closer, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, Tessa, I know we had our issues." "Issues?" That's how you describe conning me out of my inheritance and leaving me in massive debt? Issues. He sighed, dropping his gaze to the floor. I'm not proud of some things that happened. You're not proud? You're a thief, Brian, I said, my voice shaking. You stole from me, from my grandfather's estate. I was left scrambling to keep this house out of foreclosure while you went off on some Caribbean vacation to clear your head. And now you're telling me you're marrying my aunt, my own family, and you want me to be the baby's godparent? What universe are you living in? His eyes flicked up, and there was a hint of remorse there. I know it's bizarre. Miranda, she feels that the child should have a strong family connection. She kept saying that you two used to be close, that maybe this could be a way to rebuild bridges. I nearly laughed out loud at the absurdity. Rebuild bridges with a woman who had watched me suffer through heartbreak and financial ruin, then apparently decided to pick up my ex-husband as though he were a spare piece of furniture, with the man who had done irreparable harm to me? I'm done talking, I said. Please leave. He hesitated, glancing around like he wanted to say more, but ultimately he nodded and brushed past me toward the door. I escorted him out, numbness wrapping around my body like a heavy blanket. I locked the door behind him and slumped against it, letting out a tremulous breath. The nerve of that man to show up here was staggering. I reminded myself that I'd survived him before. I'd survive his reappearance too. Long after Brian left, I remained restless, pacing the living room and replaying our brief, excruciating conversation. I ended up in my grandfather's old study, a warm wood-paneled room lined with shelves of antique books. The large oak desk that dominated the center was where Grandpa used to do his important business, as he called it. As a child, I loved to sit in his massive leather chair and pretend I was an executive signing documents. As an adult, I found solace in this room whenever I felt lost or alone. I sat in that leather chair now, leaning back and closing my eyes, trying to calm the storm in my head. It had been 1.5 years since the divorce, but the memories still felt raw. Brian and I had met 4 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. I was charmed by his easy confidence, his quick wit, the way he made me feel interesting and special. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to make me laugh even on my worst days. At the time, I was living in a tiny apartment downtown, scraping by on a modest salary from my admin job at a local nonprofit. Brian appeared to have the same values as me. He talked about how he wanted to do something meaningful with his life. He said he was working on a startup project that would help small businesses with financing solutions. It all sounded noble. I had no idea how carefully he crafted his facade. We dated for 6 months before moving in together. At first, it was bliss. He cleaned up around the apartment, took me out on fun weekend adventures, then introduced me to his interesting friends, many of whom were entrepreneurs or creative types. Then, after another few months, Brian proposed. It was a warm May afternoon, and we were at my grandfather's house, the same house I now owned, sitting on the porch swing. Grandpa was inside, reading. Brian got on one knee, tears in his eyes, telling me he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. I was so overwhelmed with happiness that I said yes without hesitation. We married in a small ceremony in that very backyard. My grandfather officiated. Aunt Miranda, my mother's half-sister, acted as maid of honor. In retrospect, I recall noticing how Miranda looked at Brian that day. Her gaze lingered on him, a faint flush on her cheeks whenever he spoke to her. I brushed it off as a fleeting thing. Miranda had always been flirtatious, but I didn't consider her a threat. She was family. Brian moved in with me permanently, though we spent a lot of time caring for Grandpa, who was getting older and needed extra help. My father was out of the picture. He'd passed away years earlier, so my grandfather was the only real paternal figure I had left. Brian seemed to adore Grandpa and volunteered to help him manage some of his finances. Grandpa, who had always been trusting, allowed it. I had no reason to suspect foul play. Brian was my husband, a man who claimed to love me deeply, and I assumed he respected my family. A few months later, Grandpa passed away quietly in his sleep. I was devastated. He had been my rock, especially since I'd lost my parents. His funeral was small, attended by immediate family. Aunt Miranda was upset but seemed more composed than me. Brian held my hand the entire time, looking properly somber. Afterward, Grandpa's will named me the primary beneficiary, including the house and a substantial inheritance. I offered to share some of it with Miranda, but she waved me off, saying Grandpa had left her something separately. We parted on seemingly cordial terms. Brian convinced me that we should invest a chunk of my inheritance in his startup. It'll benefit both of us, he insisted. We can grow the money and you'll have financial freedom for the rest of your life. He even drew up what he called preliminary contracts, though I skimmed them without fully understanding. I was naive. I trusted him more than I trusted myself. I gave him access to a significant portion of the funds. A month or so later, he told me the money was tied up in a short-term investment that was about to pay off big. It all sounded great. I believed him. Then came the bombshell. I discovered strange withdrawals from my personal account. Large sums were missing, transferred into shell accounts I didn't recognize. When I confronted Brian, he spun a tale about needing to shuffle money around for legal reasons, ensuring everything was above board. I was uneasy, but still didn't want to believe he'd betray me. My love for him blinded me to obvious red flags. Things finally unraveled when he vanished for 3 weeks, leaving only a cryptic text saying he needed space to sort out some business complications. Panicked, I tried contacting him, tried tracking him down through mutual friends, but no one knew where he was. During those weeks, I received foreclosure notices for the house. Apparently, Brian had taken a second mortgage behind my back. My inheritance was either drained or locked away in accounts that no longer existed. I found an attorney to help me, but it was too late. Brian had set up everything in such a way that he covered his tracks. While I fought tooth and nail to save the house, he was off gallivanting on a business trip, which turned out to be more of a leisurely escape. He reappeared eventually, feigning regret, claiming he had done it all to ensure a better future for us. By then, I was beyond devastated. Our marriage was in tatters, my finances in ruin, and any love I once felt had burned into anger. I filed for divorce. The legal battle was messy. He tried to argue that I had willingly given him the money, which in a sense, I had. There was no conclusive paper trail proving fraud, and even my attorney said it could take years to pin him down. Instead, I focused on salvaging what remained of the house. Finally, we reached a settlement in which I kept the house and the small fraction of my grandfather's inheritance that was left. Brian vanished from my life, or so I thought. It had been 1.5 years since that final meeting in court. He left me with a battered heart, a battered credit score, and a battered faith in my own judgment. Now, apparently, he'd cozied up to my Aunt Miranda, who was pregnant with his child. The gall of it was almost too much to process. Did Miranda know the full details of what Brian had done to me? She must have had some idea, but maybe Brian had spun his own sob story, painting me as paranoid or incompetent. I rose from my grandfather's leather chair and paced the study, remembering how safe I once felt in this house. A wave of despair swept over me. My family was so small now, Mom gone, Dad gone, Grandpa gone. All that remained of the older generation was Miranda, who was now complicit with the man who ruined my life. The betrayal almost felt surreal. Finally, I decided to call my friend Kathy, who had been my ally through the divorce. She'd known Brian socially and never liked him, though she tried to be supportive while we were married. I dialed her number, my hands still trembling with leftover rage. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Tess," she greeted cheerily. "Everything okay?" "Not really," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Brian showed up here." She sucked in a breath. "You're kidding. Are you all right? Did he try something?" I sank onto the study's window seat, looking out at the overgrown rose garden. "He told me he's marrying my aunt and that they're expecting a baby. He actually wants me to be the godparent." Silence crackled on the line for a few seconds. Then Kathy let out a curse. "He's a piece of work." "No kidding. I just needed to talk to someone about it." My breath hitched. What am I supposed to do? "You can't seriously be considering his invitation," she said, alarmed. "Of course not. But Aunt Miranda, she was family before she was this fiancée of Brian's. She and I were never super close, but we got along. I just don't understand how she could do this." Kathy let out a thoughtful hum. "Maybe you should talk to her directly. At least hear what she has to say, unless you'd rather write her off completely." I hesitated. A confrontation with Miranda sounded dreadful, but I also felt I deserved answers. "I'll think about it," I said finally. We chatted a bit longer before hanging up. The idea of confronting Miranda made my stomach churn, but I realized Kathy was right. Better to talk to her than to let my imagination conjure up wild scenarios. The next day, I mustered my courage and texted Miranda to let her know Brian had dropped by and delivered his shocking news. I didn't accuse her or berate her in the message. I simply asked if we could meet to talk. Her response was prompt and conciliatory. "Yes, please. I'd like that. Let's meet at my place tomorrow afternoon." I stared at her words. My place. Last I knew, she'd been living in a condo on the other side of town, near the waterfront. I agreed to meet her there, though I had no idea what to expect. The following afternoon, I drove through a light drizzle, pulling up to Miranda's condo complex. It was an upscale development with manicured lawns and a glittering pool area, certainly more luxurious than where she'd lived a few years ago. I wondered if Brian's leftover funds or my stolen inheritance had subsidized this comfort. The thought made me ill. Miranda greeted me at the door in a flowing maternity dress that accentuated her baby bump. She gave me a cautious smile. "Tessa, thanks for coming." I stepped inside, noticing the tasteful decor, pale walls, glass furniture, plush rugs. It looked expensive, and again, I burned with resentment. She didn't offer me a hug, probably sensing how tense I was. Instead, she waved me toward the living room. "Can I get you anything? Tea? Water?" I shook my head, sitting on a sleek leather couch. She lowered herself onto the matching armchair with a small groan. "The baby's been making me sore all day," she murmured, rubbing her belly. I clasped my hands together, trying to focus. "Miranda, how could you? I mean, of all the men, Brian." She sighed, looking pained. "I know it's impossible to understand. Honestly, it just sort of happened. We ran into each other a year ago at some fundraiser event. We got talking. He told me how devastated he was that your marriage ended, how he'd made mistakes, but that you wouldn't give him another chance. Then we started seeing each other, I guess. It wasn't planned." I fought the urge to scoff. "He told you he made mistakes? That's one way of putting it. Did he also tell you how he systematically drained my inheritance, nearly forcing me to sell Grandpa's house?" My voice trembled with anger. She looked away, her cheeks coloring. "He did mention money issues, but he said you both were inexperienced with finances and that you'd basically handed him funds without proper contracts." I slammed my hand on the couch's arm. "He was my husband, Miranda. Of course I trusted him. That doesn't justify what he did. It's fraud. Or it should be. And you know I fought him in court for months. Did he gloss over that part?" She swallowed. "I know you two had a bad divorce, but from what he told me..." I couldn't help myself. "Are you serious right now? You're believing his version of events over mine? Your own niece?" Miranda's eyes flickered with guilt. "It's not that I don't believe you. I saw a side of him that was remorseful, Tessa. He felt terrible about how things ended. He told me he wanted to make amends, but that you refused to see him. So we kept talking, and I don't know, I fell for him. He proposed a few months ago, and then we found out I was pregnant." Everything about that explanation sounded naive at best, willfully blind at worst. "I can't believe you, of all people, would take his side," I said, feeling tears burn my eyes. "I lost so much because of him, and now you want me to be some kind of doting family member?" Her expression crumpled. "I'm sorry. Truly I am. But we're about to have a baby, and that baby is your cousin, after all. I was hoping, maybe foolishly, that we could find a way to move past the hurt. I miss you, Tessa. We used to be close when we were younger, remember?" I did remember. She was the fun older aunt, only 5 years older than me, who introduced me to fashion magazines and let me borrow her CDs. But the sense of betrayal now overshadowed those memories. "I'm not sure I can do this," I murmured, voice raw. "I can't pretend to be okay with you two being together." Miranda's eyes watered. "I know, but for the baby's sake." The baby. A child who would be my cousin, yet also the child of my ex-husband. It was surreal. "Even if I wanted to be civil, what about the fact that Brian stole from me? Has he offered to repay a single cent? Has he tried to rectify the damage he did?" She winced. "He mentioned wanting to repay you once his new business venture takes off. You know how he always has some project in the works." I let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, I do know, and I also know how those projects usually end. with him disappearing and leaving me to pick up the pieces. She looked miserable. Tessa, I'm sorry. I really am. I guess I thought if he's finally learned from his mistakes. You're gambling, I cut in, hoping that he's changed. But what if he hasn't? What if you end up just like me, heartbroken and broke? Have you considered that? Miranda pressed a hand to her belly. I have, but I want to believe in him. I love him. And it's too late to turn back now. We have a baby on the way. Can't you understand that maybe he's grown up? People do change sometimes. I stared at my aunt, this woman who was old enough to know better. Once upon a time, we'd been friends. Now, it felt like she was a stranger, roped in by the same illusions Brian had used on me. I can't promise anything, I finally said, my voice thick. I don't even know if I can attend your wedding, much less be the baby's godmother. Her eyes brimmed with tears. Please, just think about it. If not for me or Brian, then for the child. They deserve a family. I stood, my legs unsteady. I'll think about it, I said, though my heart felt cold, but don't expect miracles. I left, ignoring the tears that slipped down my cheeks. So much for a calm conversation. I felt more confused than ever. Part of me wanted to sever ties with them both and never look back. Another part remembered how lonely it was to go through a pregnancy without support. Though I'd never been pregnant, I'd watched my mother go it alone once my dad passed. This baby, my future cousin, was innocent in all this. Did I have some moral obligation to provide a lifeline? But how could I stand by and play the role of benevolent relative when the father had robbed me blind? Over the next week, I buried myself in work, trying to avoid any thoughts of Brian, Miranda, or the baby. I worked at a local gallery, having transitioned from my old admin job after my divorce. The gallery specialized in regional art, and I'd taken on a management role, coordinating exhibitions and artist events. It was a peaceful environment, filled with creative energy, a welcome distraction from my personal soap opera. Yet the tension gnawed at me day and night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Brian's smug face or Miranda's anxious expression. I also started hearing rumors from extended family members who'd gotten wind of the upcoming wedding. A few cousins texted me, asking if it was true that Aunt Miranda was marrying my ex. The entire fiasco threatened to become a family scandal. Part of me wanted to hide from it all, hole up in Grandpa's house with the lights off. Kathy, ever the supportive friend, insisted I needed some emotional release, maybe a road trip or a weekend away. But I couldn't escape my life forever. The wedding was scheduled for next month, according to Brian's half-baked invitation. Miranda texted me regularly, gentle reminders of how she hoped I'd attend. As the days ticked by, my anger started morphing into a reluctant curiosity. Maybe I should see exactly how this wedding played out. Maybe I needed to witness it to find closure. And what about the baby? Did I want to push away a child who, through no fault of their own, would be part of my family? Finally, 2 weeks before the wedding date, I got a letter in the mail. An actual letter, not a text or email. It was from Miranda, on creamy stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. She wrote about how sorry she was, how much she wanted me there on her big day, how Brian was working on making amends and wanted to speak with me personally about repaying what he could. She ended by saying, I know how deeply he hurt you. I know you probably hate me for being with him, but we're family, Tessa, and I'm asking you to please find it in your heart to show up. I reread that letter 3 times, torn between fury and guilt. In a weaker moment, I might have tossed it in the trash, but something in me couldn't let go of the idea that maybe, just maybe, I could find a sliver of healing. So I did the unthinkable. I texted Miranda that I would attend the wedding, but only under certain conditions, that Brian and I have a serious talk about finances beforehand, that he lay out exactly what he planned to do regarding my lost inheritance. Miranda responded with gratitude, telling me she'd set up a meeting soon. That meeting took place at a downtown cafe a few days later, just me and Brian. I didn't want Miranda there. This was between the two of us. I arrived first, settling into a corner booth where I could see the entrance. My palms were damp with sweat. Why was I doing this? My better sense told me Brian was a snake. Yet here I was, giving him the chance to talk. He showed up 10 minutes late, wearing a neatly pressed shirt, slacks, and that same confident smile. When he slid into the booth across from me, I caught a whiff of expensive cologne. Everything about him screamed polished on the outside. I wondered if it was just another mask. "Thanks for coming," he began. "I know this is awkward." I folded my arms. "It's only awkward if you're expecting me to let bygones be bygones. I'm here for answers about my money." He winced, leaning forward. "I get that, and I want to fix things. Truth is, I'm in the middle of launching a legitimate business, an online platform that helps local artisans connect with bigger markets. It's going well, but it's still new. I don't have the capital right now to repay you in full." I snorted. "You can drop the sales pitch, Brian. I want to hear actual numbers. How much do you owe me? How do you plan to repay it, and when?" He took out his phone, opened some documents, and started explaining a projected revenue plan for his new venture. My eyes glazed over. This was exactly how he'd trapped me before, talking fast, throwing around terms about investment potential and exponential growth. After 5 minutes, I held up a hand. "I'm not interested in pie-in-the-sky projections," I said. "I want a real schedule of repayment. Do you have a lawyer or accountant who can draft a legitimate agreement? Because I'm sure as hell not giving you any more chances without it in writing." He nodded, seeming chastened. "I can get you that. I'll have my accountant draw a plan. I can't promise I'll pay it all back in a year or two, but I can start with a percentage of profits each month." I stared at him, trying to gauge sincerity. "I'll believe it when I see it. Anything else?" He hesitated. "I want you to know that Miranda and I aren't doing this to hurt you. She really wants you in our lives, especially as the baby's aunt cousin, technically. But you know what I mean. And if there's a chance to repair the damage I did..." I cut him off. "You can't repair the damage, Brian. You can't give me back the years of stress and heartbreak. I'm only here because Miranda asked, and because if there's a child involved, I'd rather not let your sins ruin their connection to the rest of the family." He looked down, fiddling with his phone. "I understand," he said softly. "Let me prove I'm trying. Let me get you that repayment plan. And if you show up at the wedding, maybe we can start fresh. It doesn't have to be perfect, but at least civil." Civil. What a low bar. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell. But I also recalled the heartbreak of losing my own father young, the devastation of growing up with a fractured family. This child deserved better. "We'll see," I finally said. "I'm not making any promises. I'll check out whatever paperwork you bring and I'll come to your wedding. But if I smell one hint of deceit, I'm gone." He nodded, relief flooding his face. "Thank you." I didn't respond. I gathered my purse and left. The conversation felt surreal, as though I'd stepped into an alternate timeline. But at least now there was a glimmer of possibility. If Brian truly followed through and repaid even a fraction of what he owed, it might bring me some closure. And if Miranda was sincere about wanting me to be part of this child's life, maybe, in time, I could put the betrayal behind me. It was a long shot, but a small part of me was tired of carrying the bitterness. The rest of me, however, remained deeply skeptical. The next few days were a whirlwind of wedding preparations, or so I gathered from Miranda's texts. She was finalizing the venue, a small botanical garden, and had apparently chosen a simple ceremony with close friends and relatives. She kept asking for my input, colors, seating arrangements, music, but I felt uncomfortable being so involved. Eventually, I asked her to stop. "Miranda, I'm not your wedding planner," I said tersely. "I'm barely holding myself together for this." She apologized profusely, saying she was just excited. I sighed, thinking how insane it was that my aunt was planning to marry my ex-husband while carrying his baby, all under the guise of a blended family. Maybe in an odd, twisted way, this was how family trees grew bizarre branches. The night before the wedding, I was a nervous wreck, pacing my bedroom and staring at the half-finished repayment agreement Brian's accountant had emailed. It promised me a certain percentage of revenue from his new business, dispersed quarterly, with an approximate total that would take him at least 5 years to pay back if everything went smoothly. Of course, that was a big if. But maybe it was a start. Maybe I should focus on the baby, on the possibility of giving that child a broader family support system. At least that was the story I told myself to rationalize the dread burning in my gut. The wedding day dawned bright and breezy. I dressed in a simple blue sundress, not wanting to draw attention. When I arrived at the botanical garden, I saw clusters of chairs set up by a gazebo. White ribbons adorned the walkway, and a few guests mingled, sipping lemonade or iced tea. I recognized some of them, distant cousins, a couple of Miranda's friends, and presumably some of Brian's acquaintances. I felt out of place. Then I spotted Kathy, my plus one by default. She'd come for moral support. "Over here," she whispered, waving me over. I joined her in a row near the back. She gave me a sympathetic look. "This must feel so weird," she said. "You have no idea," I muttered, scanning the scene. Miranda was off to the side with a small group, presumably her bridal party. Brian stood near the gazebo, chatting with a tall man who looked like an usher. I felt my stomach flip at the sight of him in a dark suit, looking every bit the polished groom. A wave of memories threatened to overtake me, our own wedding day, how handsome he'd looked, how hopeful I'd felt. I forced myself to breathe. Minutes later, the ceremony began. Miranda walked down the makeshift aisle, her baby bump evident beneath a flowing white gown that was more bohemian than traditional. She looked radiant, if I was honest, with a wreath of flowers in her hair. The officiant was the same local pastor who had done my grandfather's funeral, which felt oddly symbolic life and death, weddings and funerals, all intertwined in this circle of family events. They exchanged vows. I tuned out most of it, too busy battling the swirl of emotions inside me. I caught a glimpse of Brian's expression as he slipped a ring on Miranda's finger. He seemed genuine, deeply moved. I wondered if he'd worn that same face when we married. I couldn't recall. When the officiant announced them husband and wife, the small crowd clapped politely. Miranda and Brian shared a kiss, and there was a smattering of cheers. My hands felt cold. Kathy gave me a discreet squeeze on my arm. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. My mind was spinning. The ceremony transitioned into a short reception with refreshments. I tried to blend into the background, but Miranda found me. She was glowing with happiness, albeit flushed from the heat. "Thank you for coming," she said, placing a hand on my arm. "It means so much to me." I forced a small smile. "Congratulations," I offered. It felt hollow, but I managed to sound sincere enough. She lowered her voice. "I know this is weird, but I hope we can grow past it. Brian told me you two talked about a repayment plan. If he follows through, maybe that will help mend some fences." I shrugged, uncertain. "We'll see. I want to believe it, but I won't hold my breath." She nodded, looking remorseful but then brightening. "We're going to have a little speech soon. Cut the cake. Then we'd like to talk to you about the christening or baptism or whatever we decide. We'd love for you to be the baby's godmother." My heart thudded. "Miranda, are you sure that's a good idea? I'm still dealing with everything that happened between me and Brian." She offered a tremulous smile. "I understand, but you're the closest family this baby has, besides me, obviously. I want them to know you. I want them to have you in their life." I swallowed hard, thinking about the future, this unborn child, my complicated role in its life. Could I truly stand beside Brian and Miranda at a christening, pledging to support their child's spiritual or moral upbringing? The thought made my head swim. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice tight. Miranda left to mingle with other guests, and Kathy sidled up to me. "She's serious about wanting you in the kid's life, huh?" I nodded, staring at the newlyweds who were now being fussed over by a photographer. "Seems so." Kathy hesitated, then said softly, "You don't owe them anything, Tessa. Don't forget that." Those words echoed in my mind as the reception continued. I kept a low profile, sipping water, not wanting to drink champagne or anything that might dull my wits. At one point, Brian took the microphone to thank everyone. He mentioned how lucky he felt to have found Miranda and how excited he was to become a father. He even turned to me, giving me a brief nod of acknowledgement as he said, "We're especially grateful to Tessa for being here, and we hope this is the beginning of healing in our extended family." A few guests clapped. I wanted to sink into the ground. When the event wound down, I found myself alone by a small koi pond, arms crossed, thinking about how drastically life had veered off course. Just a few years ago, I was the one pledging forever with Brian. Now he was married to my aunt. I felt used up, cast aside, yet also weighed down by the knowledge that there was a new life, an innocent baby, hanging in the balance. I heard footsteps behind me. Brian's voice said quietly, "Hey, can we talk for a second?" I glanced over my shoulder, seeing him approach with caution, hands in his pockets. I guess, I said, turning back to the pond. He stood next to me, gazing at the koi fish. Thank you for coming, he repeated. It means a lot to Miranda and to me. I remained silent. I want you to know I asked my accountant to expedite that repayment agreement, he went on. We should have a final version soon. I plan to stick to it, Tessa. I know you probably don't trust me, but I want to try to make this right. A hollow laugh escaped my lips. You think a few $1,000s every quarter for the next however many years will make it right? Money can't fix everything you did, but if you're sincere, I appreciate the gesture. He nodded, exhaling. I'm not perfect. I did a lot of stupid things. I hope one day you'll forgive me, or at least tolerate me, for the baby's sake, if nothing else. I studied his face. He looked earnest, but how many times had I seen that expression? Time will tell, I said, turning away. I have to go. He stepped back, letting me leave. Kathy and I slipped out, heading toward my car. The entire drive home, my emotions warred inside me. Anger, sadness, a flicker of relief that maybe I'd get some of my money back, and a swirl of confusion about what role I was supposed to play in this child's life. By the time I arrived at my grandfather's old Victorian, night had fallen, and I felt drained. I locked the door behind me, sank onto the sofa, and let out a shaky breath. Why is this happening? I whispered to the empty room. The old walls offered no answer. In the days that followed, the official repayment agreement arrived via email. I read it carefully, even showed it to a lawyer friend of Kathy's for a second opinion. It wasn't perfect. There was always a chance Brian's new venture could fail. But if it succeeded, I stood to recoup a decent chunk of my inheritance. The friend advised me to request a few revisions to tighten the terms. I did, and to my mild surprise, Brian complied. We ended up with a legally binding document that he electronically signed. It felt surreal. If he truly followed through, I'd receive quarterly payments for the next 5 years, with the possibility of renegotiation if his business boomed. It was the best I could hope for at that point. Meanwhile, Miranda kept nudging me about the godparent question. She texted me ultrasound pictures, updates about the baby's development. She was due in about 4 months. She also asked if I'd join them for a small family dinner, just the 3 of us, to discuss the baby's future. I hesitated, feeling dread coil in my stomach. But again, a small voice reminded me that turning my back on the baby wouldn't heal my wounds. Perhaps I needed to see this through, to face them both regularly until the anger became manageable. So I agreed, though I felt a swirl of anxiety as the date of that dinner approached. I tried to quell my nerves by focusing on practical details. I had the repayment agreement, so at least I wasn't completely powerless anymore. If Brian defaulted, there were legal consequences spelled out. And if I found the dinner unbearable, I could leave anytime. That thought reassured me a little. The dinner took place at Miranda's condo. She'd prepared a simple meal: chicken, vegetables, a light salad. Brian greeted me politely at the door. It was bizarre to see them playing happy couple in a cozy domestic setting. Miranda's belly was more pronounced now, and she looked tired but content. We ate at a small dining table overlooking the condo's balcony. The conversation was stilted at first, mostly about mundane topics: work, the weather, the baby's healthy progress. Then Miranda took a deep breath and set down her fork. We wanted to talk about the christening or dedication ceremony. We're not super religious, but we do want some spiritual or communal blessing for the baby, and we'd love for you to be godmother, Tessa. I swallowed hard. I'm still not sure. This is all so complicated. Brian spoke quietly. We understand. We just want the baby to have a strong family presence. I don't really have any close relatives, and Miranda's side is basically you. Miranda's cheeks reddened. I know how weird this must sound, but I do love you, Tessa. Regardless of everything that's happened, I want you to be part of my child's life. I stared at my plate, mind swirling. I need time to think, I said, echoing my words from earlier. Being a godparent isn't just a casual title. It implies a lifetime commitment. Miranda nodded eagerly, leaning forward. Exactly, and that's why it means so much to us to choose someone who's truly family, not just a friend or acquaintance, someone who cares about our history, who understands who we are, even if it's messy. I couldn't help a bitter laugh. Messy is an understatement. She pressed her hands together. I know, but maybe that's all the more reason. If we can move forward despite the mess, it'll show that we can overcome anything. I set down my fork, appetite gone. Miranda, do you honestly believe Brian's changed? I still have nightmares about how he took everything from me. I'm not trying to be dramatic, I just can't forget. She exchanged a glance with Brian, who lowered his head. Then she reached across the table, touching my hand gently. I won't pretend to know the future, but I've seen him show genuine remorse. I've seen him put in real effort to build something honest with this new business. I'm betting my life on him, in a way. Maybe it's foolish, but I'm choosing to trust that he's learned from his mistakes. And I'm hoping you might do the same, in time. Her words struck a chord. I remembered how Grandpa used to talk about second chances and how everyone deserved a shot at redemption. I wasn't sure if I believed that wholeheartedly, but I could at least grasp why Miranda was giving it a go. As for me, I still felt raw, but I also recognized that carrying this resentment forever would only poison my own life. All right, I said finally, voice unsteady. I'll consider being the baby's godmother, but I'm setting some conditions. Brian must stick to the repayment plan. No excuses. And if at any point I sense deception or manipulation, I'm out. Brian exhaled, nodding vigorously. Deal. Miranda beamed. Thank you, Tessa. We won't let you down. Part of me felt relief, another part fear. I was making a tentative agreement with the two people who had caused me more pain than anyone else in the world. It was a leap of faith, or foolishness, depending on how you looked at it. In the weeks that followed, life fell into a strange rhythm. I saw Brian and Miranda occasionally, doctor's appointments for the baby, short family dinners where we talked about the baby's name options or nursery plans. Miranda was well into her third trimester, and she often looked exhausted, though she kept up a cheerful front. Brian, for his part, kept me updated on the progress of his new business. He even showed me some financials, mildly impressive, though I wasn't entirely convinced. At least, he wired me my first payment according to the schedule. It was a small sum, but it was something, a tangible sign that he might be trying. I confided in Kathy about the bizarre turn of events. She was cautious, warning me not to get sucked into another con. I assured her I was keeping my guard up. Yet, a piece of me welcomed the possibility of closure. If Brian really repaid the money, and if the baby arrived healthy and I became the godmother, maybe I could rewrite the narrative of betrayal into something resembling reconciliation. Still, I was haunted by nightmares. Some nights I dreamed that Brian drained my accounts again, or that Miranda left him and stuck me with a child to raise. Other times I dreamed of my grandfather, who stared at me with sorrowful eyes, as if asking why I was letting his house be the backdrop for a new round of heartbreak. Each morning, I'd shake off the dreams and try to face the day with guarded optimism. Miranda went into labor on a sweltering afternoon in July. She called me, voice shaking with pain, asking if I could meet them at the hospital. I rushed over, heart hammering. This was happening. A new life was about to enter the world, my complicated cousin, niece, nephew. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic, and the fluorescent lights felt harsh. I found Miranda in a birthing suite, hooked up to monitors, with Brian at her side looking anxious. She reached for my hand when I came in. Hours passed in a blur of contractions, nurses coming and going, Miranda's labored breathing. I stayed by her side, offering ice chips, words of encouragement. Despite everything that lay between us in that moment, the old familial bond resurfaced. I wanted her to be safe, wanted the baby to be healthy. Finally, a shrill cry echoed through the room. The baby was born, a girl. Miranda wept, Brian wept, and my eyes stung with tears I couldn't quite name. The nurse handed the newborn to Miranda, who gazed at her daughter with awe. Brian leaned in, his face alight with wonder. The baby was small, pink, and squalling, but she had a formidable presence already. Miranda managed a teary smile at me. Tessa, meet your cousin, Amelia Rose. Amelia Rose. My breath caught. I approached gingerly, peering at this tiny human who was, in a sense, connected to me in a mind-boggling way. She was half Brian's child, half my aunt's child, and yet she was entirely innocent of the drama that preceded her. For a moment, the enormity of it all struck me. Here I was, the ex-wife of the father, the niece of the mother, stepping into a role that might be part caretaker, part moral guide. Could I do this? Could I be the stable presence they wanted me to be? Miranda looked at me pleadingly, as if sensing my internal question. You'll be her godmother, right? She whispered, voice laced with hope. Brian glanced up, meeting my eyes with an unspoken prayer that I'd accept. I thought of the heartbreak, the betrayal, the stolen inheritance. I thought of the baby, brand new to the world, deserving of a loving, supportive family. Yes, I said softly, tears slipping down my cheeks. I'll do it. Miranda's face crumpled with relief. Brian closed his eyes, mouthing a silent, "Thank you." And I felt the weight of this promise settle on my shoulders. A promise to be there for Amelia, to stand by her side, to protect her from the mistakes of her parents, if necessary. The christening took place a few weeks later, a small, private ceremony at a charming little chapel near the house I inherited. I stood at the front beside Miranda and Brian, holding Amelia, who wore a delicate white gown. The pastor spoke about family, about faith, about the responsibility of godparents. At times, his words felt almost too pointed, referencing the need for forgiveness and unity. The congregation was just a handful of us. Kathy was there for moral support along with a few friends. Aunt Miranda had few relatives besides me. Brian's side was nearly non-existent, so it was an intimate gathering. When the pastor asked if I vowed to guide Amelia spiritually and morally, I hesitated for a split second, glancing at Brian. He gazed back with an expression I interpreted as apology or gratitude, maybe both. Then I answered, "I do," letting the vow settle over me like a mantle. Afterwards, we gathered in a small courtyard behind the chapel for a simple reception. Kathy gave me a gentle hug. "Proud of you," she whispered. "That couldn't have been easy." I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and hope. In the courtyard, guests congratulated Brian and Miranda on their new baby, on the sweet christening. I hung back, watching them pass Amelia from person to person. My aunt seemed truly happy, and Brian appeared more grounded than I'd ever seen him. Was it genuine transformation, or just another act? I couldn't say for sure. Eventually, Brian approached me while Miranda was chatting with a neighbor. He gently touched my arm. "You doing okay?" he asked softly. I studied his face, searching for signs of deceit. I saw wariness, worry lines around his eyes, but also a hint of sincerity. "As well as I can be," I said. "Is Amelia doing all right?" "She seemed fussy earlier." He nodded. "New environment, lots of strangers. She's fine now." He paused. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate you doing this. I know how much I hurt you." I held up a hand. "I'm not doing this for you, Brian. I'm doing it for Amelia, and for Miranda, I guess, since she's family. You're just the father in this equation." He gave a wry smile. "Fair enough. Still, I hope maybe one day you'll see that I'm genuinely sorry and that I've changed. I'm sticking to the repayment schedule. Actually, my business is doing well, so I might even be able to pay more than the minimum soon." I forced myself to remain composed. "That'd be nice, but I'll believe it when I see it." He nodded, accepting my guarded response. "Understood." Miranda joined us, cradling Amelia, who had just fallen asleep. We all stood there, a strange triangle, each with our own unspoken histories. The soft hush of the baby's breathing provided a fragile sense of peace. For a moment, we were united by a tiny life that bound us all in a bizarre familial bond. Over the following months, I continued to receive the scheduled payments from Brian's business venture. Surprisingly, the amounts began to increase slightly as he claimed new partnerships, new revenue streams. I double-checked the numbers with an accountant, and they seemed legitimate. The money didn't erase my anger, but it was tangible proof that Brian was keeping his word this time. With each deposit, a portion of my grandfather's legacy was restored to me. I used the funds to maintain the Victorian house, renovating some neglected areas so it wouldn't fall into disrepair. I also found myself visiting Miranda's condo occasionally, checking on Amelia. True to my pledge, I tried to be a supportive figure in her life, helping my aunt with childcare here and there. I even read stories to Amelia while Miranda napped, exhausted from the demands of a newborn. Over time, I grew to love that baby, her tiny fingers gripping mine, her wide-eyed wonder at the simplest things. Watching her gurgle and coo, free from any knowledge of adult betrayals, softened something in me. I realized that by remaining involved, I could ensure Amelia had at least one stable, trustworthy role model in her life. Brian was around too, of course, but our interactions were civil, not warm. He kept me updated on his business finances, probably hoping to earn more trust. Sometimes he'd try to chat about inconsequential things, sports scores, local news, but I rarely engaged. My boundaries remained firm. Still, I noticed he was surprisingly attentive to Amelia, more so than I would have expected. Perhaps fatherhood awakened a sense of responsibility in him that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps he was just skilled at faking paternal devotion. Time would tell. Kathy pointed out that I seemed calmer these days, less prone to bursts of resentment whenever Brian's name came up. Maybe it was the therapy sessions I'd resumed, or maybe it was simply the passage of time. My therapist said that acknowledging my anger and turning it into constructive boundaries, like the repayment schedule, could help me find a healthier way to coexist with Brian's presence in my life. I still had nightmares occasionally, but they became less frequent. Instead of seeing Brian as an all-powerful figure who robbed me, I began to see him as a flawed man whose selfishness had caused me immeasurable pain, yet who might now be trying to redeem himself. I didn't have to love or forgive him completely. I just had to navigate this new reality. Miranda, on her end, grew more confident as a mother. She confided that Brian was better than she expected. He woke up for night feedings, helped with chores, and was genuinely pitching in financially. She acknowledged that part of her still worried about his track record, but she chose to believe in second chances. I said little, but I could see her happiness was genuine. Part of me envied her. Part of me wanted to protect her from the potential heartbreak I had endured. Yet maybe Brian wouldn't do it again. People could change, right? Amelia's first birthday arrived faster than I anticipated. Miranda organized a small party in the same botanical garden where they'd married, though this time it was just close family and a few friends. I helped set up balloons and a tiny cake shaped like a butterfly. Amelia toddled around, wide-eyed at the decorations, squealing whenever she saw something colorful. Brian hovered protectively, smiling in a way that looked less forced than I'd ever seen. Perhaps fatherhood truly had reshaped him. When it came time to cut the cake, Miranda lifted Amelia so she could poke at the frosting with a chubby hand. Everyone laughed as the baby smeared pink icing across her face. I stood back, camera in hand, snapping photos for posterity. Afterward, Miranda insisted on a group photo her, Brian, Amelia, and me, the godmother. I stiffened initially but relented, letting someone else take the shot. I crouched next to Amelia's high chair while Miranda and Brian stood behind us. In the photo, Amelia giggled and Miranda beamed. Brian smiled politely, and I managed a small grin. Looking at the snapshot, I realized we all appeared somewhat happy, at least in that frozen moment. How strange that we'd come so far from the day I confronted him about my stolen inheritance. Later, as the party wound down, I wandered among the blooming flowers. The scent of jasmine filled the air. I closed my eyes, recalling Grandpa's face, the warmth of his study. I remembered how he used to say, "Family isn't just blood, it's about who shows up, who cares enough to stand by you." In a twisted way, Brian had once been family, then an enemy, and now something uncertain. Miranda was my aunt, yet practically my peer, who had chosen to link her life to the man who betrayed me. And Amelia was the baby who tied us together in an unbreakable knot of biology and circumstance. I felt footsteps approach. Brian, again. He stopped a few paces away, giving me space. "Did you get enough photos?" he asked. I nodded. "Probably too many," I said lightly. "Amelia's going to look back at these someday and wonder why we fuss so much." He chuckled softly. "She's a special kid, and we're lucky to have you in her life. I meant what I said, Tessa. I know I can't fix the past, but I'm committed to paying you back and to being a decent father." I studied him, noticing the faint worry lines on his forehead. "I'm holding you to your word," I said. "So far, you've done what you promised. Keep it up." He nodded, glancing down at a rose bush. "I will. And thanks for giving Amelia the kind of extended family she deserves." I swallowed, unsure how to respond. "Don't make me regret it," I said eventually. He met my gaze. "I won't." We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension thinner than it used to be. Then Amelia squealed from across the garden, and Miranda called out for Brian to join them. With a final, uncertain smile, he walked away. As time rolled on, Amelia grew from a wobbly toddler into a curious, bright-eyed child. Miranda managed to keep her condo, thanks in part to Brian's apparently stable income from his ever-expanding business. I kept receiving quarterly payments, inching closer to reclaiming most of my inheritance. True, the money arrived slower than if Brian had simply written me a lump sum check, but at least It was coming. The improvements I made on my grandfather's house turned it into a real home again, one I could feel proud of. Sometimes I hosted small gatherings for friends or for the small bits of extended family left in our tree. Miranda and Brian even visited a couple of times, bringing Amelia so she could run around the yard. I never lost track of the fact that I was entertaining the man who once nearly destroyed me. But life was strange. Kathy observed all this with wary approval. "You're basically forging a new normal," she said one day over coffee. "Does it feel weird letting go of so much anger?" I sipped my latte, thinking, yes and no. I still remember everything, but holding on to the anger was draining. I'm not sure if I'd say I've forgiven him. Maybe I just decided to relegate him to the role of Amelia's dad in my mind, someone I keep an eye on but don't let close emotionally. Kathy raised her brows. "That sounds healthy, actually." I shrugged, aware that I was still sorting out how I felt. But at least I wasn't seething with rage all the time, and that counted for something. Eventually, about 2 years after Amelia's birth, Brian surprised me by sending a lump sum payment, one that drastically reduced his remaining debt. He said his business had hit a milestone. It meant that, at long last, I had recouped nearly the full amount of my inheritance. The final portion, he assured me, would come soon. I was stunned. Part of me expected him to vanish into the night or pull another con, but he hadn't. Instead, he'd methodically repaid me. Coupled with the expansion I'd done on the house, I felt more financially secure than ever. That night, I sat in Grandpa's old study, gazing at the check. My eyes welled with tears. Memories crowded in. Grandpa reading documents at this very desk, telling me how he trusted I'd do something good with my inheritance. Then the memory of Brian sweet-talking me into investing, the heartbreak that followed. Now, ironically, Brian was fulfilling the role of restitution, perhaps in his own twisted quest for redemption. I folded the check carefully, tucking it into an envelope. I would deposit it the next day, marking the near completion of a painful saga. A swirl of emotions coursed through me, relief, sadness, a hint of peace. In another room of the house, I'd set up a small corner to display family photos, including one of Amelia at her christening. She was the reason I'd stayed, the reason I'd found a thread of empathy. Maybe that was Grandpa's legacy shining through, a belief that people could still come together in spite of everything. In the months that followed, things remained calm. I no longer dreaded seeing Brian or Miranda. They invited me to Amelia's preschool events. Occasionally I joined them, standing in the audience as Amelia, with her curly hair and bright eyes, proudly performed a sing-along. She'd spot me, wave excitedly, and my heart would swell. Afterward, we'd gather a peculiar but functional family unit for ice cream. I had my own life, my own independence, and I still kept them at arm's length emotionally, but it wasn't hostile. It was a sort of truce. One afternoon, I returned home from work to find an envelope in my mailbox with the last chunk of Brian's repayment. A handwritten note inside read, "Final installment. Thank you for giving me a chance to make it right. Sincerely, Brian." I stood in my entryway, staring at that note for a long time, tears prickling my eyes. He'd done it. He had completed the repayment in full. My grandfather's inheritance was truly mine again. I could almost feel Grandpa's spirit in the house, nodding with approval that the circle was closed. It struck me that the entire ordeal, Brian's theft, his marriage to Miranda, the birth of Amelia, had forced me to rebuild my life from a place of utter vulnerability. I'd learned to set boundaries, to demand accountability, and to choose a cautious path between resentment and begrudging tolerance. Perhaps that was the best I could do. No neat bow, no fairy tale ending where we all adored each other. Just a tenuous peace, anchored by a little girl who was too innocent to understand how improbable her family was. Later that evening, Miranda texted me a photo of Amelia playing with blocks, giggling. Beneath it, she wrote, "She keeps saying she loves her Aunt Tessa. We all appreciate you so much." I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Love you too, Amelia. Tell her Aunt Tessa says hi." That was all. Yet it felt profound to say love you in any capacity connected to Brian. But Amelia was different. She was my family, and I did love her. Standing in my living room, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Brian had stolen my inheritance, married my aunt, and for the longest time, I thought his presence would only bring me pain. Yet through a complicated series of events, I'd chosen to remain part of their child's life. I had become Amelia's godmother. I'd faced the man who betrayed me, demanded repayment, and received it. And along the way, I discovered that while scars never fully disappear, they can fade enough to allow new possibilities. If someone had told me years earlier that I'd end up co-parenting in some form with my ex-husband and my aunt, I would have laughed or screamed. But life had twisted us together in a knot so tight that it forced us to find a way to coexist. And perhaps in an odd, bittersweet way, I was better for it. Stronger, wiser, more capable of balancing empathy with self-preservation. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, imagining how Grandpa might react to all this drama. Maybe he'd grin and say, "Family sure does keep things interesting, doesn't it?" Then he'd wink at me, reminding me that love and resilience can spring from the strangest soil. I couldn't rewrite the past. Brian had stolen from me. Miranda had chosen him despite knowing the pain he caused. They had a child I was bound to through blood and vows. Yet in the end, here I stood, unbroken, reclaiming my inheritance and forging an unexpected role in Amelia's life. There were no illusions that we were one big happy family, but we were, in some sense, a family. I placed Brian's final payment in the lockbox where I kept important documents, feeling a sense of completion settle over me. Tomorrow, I'd deposit the funds into the account I used for the house's upkeep. I'd keep living, keep building, keep loving my home the way Grandpa had hoped. And if, in the years to come, Amelia asked me about her parents' complicated history, I'd tell her the truth, that none of us were perfect, that mistakes were made, but that sometimes through perseverance and a bit of grace, we could forge a new path that honored the best parts of who we were. And that, I realized, was enough. I didn't need Brian's remorse or Miranda's apologies to define my happiness anymore. I had found my own sense of peace, my own way forward, and I was no longer drowning in anger or self-doubt. The house, my heritage, was safe. My future was mine to shape, and little Amelia, my goddaughter, would know that despite our messy origins, she had a place in my heart. With that thought, I turned off the lights, climbed the old staircase to my bedroom, and settled under the covers. The house was quiet, but not lonely. Somewhere in the city, Brian and Miranda were soothing Amelia to sleep, living their own lives. We were all moving forward, however awkwardly, tied together by family bonds that refused to break. As I drifted off, I felt the faintest glow of contentment in my chest. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and it was mine. Sometimes that's all we can ask for, to survive the betrayals, to claim our inheritances, financial and emotional, and to find a path to fragile but genuine peace. And that was what I had done, despite all odds.